Hi everyone, this is Matthew Janner for Card Runners, and I'm here with a Tourney Theory Part 4, 30 and lower big blind stack play, and we're going to continue right where we left off. Now, if you remember, in the last video, we discussed how when the button min raises and the big blind goes all in with very little stack depth, the button can call with his entire range. So that was Snowy's range advice, to call with absolutely everything that he opened with pre-flop. And we can look at what that range looks like right here. So these are all the hands that the button opened with, and he's calling a jam with all those hands against a big blind jam. Now think for a minute. If the button is always calling a big blind jam, so the big blind has no fold equity on his jam, what should the big blind jamming range look like? Should it be a linear range, a polarized range, or a condensed range? I think this is going to be very important later. Should it be a linear range, a polarized range, or a condensed range? And the answer, of course, is if the button's not folding anything to the jam, you're only going to want to get more money in the pot if you're the big blind with your better hands. So let's go back to the situation where we saw the pre-flop advice. The big blind was only jamming with its strongest hands because it knew it was going to get called. So that's why you see it going all in with all the strongest hands. And this does look like a very linear range. It's not a polarized range. And you can also probably see, I really doubt that it's correct to use like all these mixed strategies. I think it's just Snowy not really knowing. So you're just going to want to jam all the better stuff, right? Like, I highly doubt ace-9 suited is as profitable as a call as is a 3-bet all-in, even though Snowy's suggesting a mixed strategy. But you can take the important conceptual message home, and we didn't need Snowy to tell us this, but if the button's never folding to a 3-bet all-in, then you only want a 3-bet all-in with your good hands. Oh, what's that? It's a perfect transition to concept number 3. 3-betting out of position with little stack depth. So, we understand when we'd use a linear 3-betting range preflop. So, when we have no calling range. So, if we have no calling range, then why would we, we wouldn't 3-bet a polarized range, right? A polarized range is like some really good stuff and some less good stuff. Well, if we have no calling range, we're just going to 3-bet only the best hands. So that happens like in some small blind spots in cash games. If button opens and I'm in the small blind in a cash game, I don't have a calling range there because it's too vulnerable to the big blind squeezing. And it also doesn't usually play well to be out of position multi-way. So I only 3-bet or fold in the small blind against a button open. So that range is linear. I might as well just use all the good hands. It makes no sense to polarize it. And then we also do it when our opponent has no folding range. This one could get a little bit more complicated, but I think it's pretty much safe to say, unless you're being like really nitty about some spots, if your opponent's never going to fold, you're just going to put all the money in with all the good hands pre-flop. And even saying like a good hand can be a little bit confusing because we talked about robust and non-robust equity. But for the most part, the big blind 3-betting range we just saw was a linear range. It was just, hey, let's put all the money in with the best hands because our opponent never folds. So we'll do this when we have very little stack depth. Now, when should we be using a polarized 3-betting range specifically from the big blind? So we already know we use a polarized 3-betting range when we're in position and we have a calling range. So like for 100 big blind stacks in a cash game, if the cutoff opens and we're in the button, most people, myself included, prefer to have a calling range there. So they end up 3-betting a polarized range. Some really good stuff and some stuff that has robust equity but doesn't play that well as a call. So that's a polarized 3-betting range. But when do you use a polarized 3-betting range from the big blind? Because as we just saw, we did not use a polarized 3-betting range when we were shallow. Polarized big blind 3-betting ranges. We use a polarized 3-betting range when our 3-bet actually has some fold equity. This requires the stack depth to make a reasonable size 3-bet. This is so important right here. We're going to talk about it a lot more, and then I'm eventually going to make some ranges. But you have to have the stack depth to make a 3-bet size that will give you some fold equity to want to use a polarized 3-betting range. Because remember, if our opponent's never going to fold, we're just going to make the pot bigger with all our good hands. Whereas we need the opponent to fold to be like, hey, let's 3-bet this kind of weakish hand because we can make our opponent fold something that does really well against us. So let's briefly look at my default 3-betting range in the big blind versus button open for cash games. So this is one range I know really well, and we'll just go over it a bit. Okay, so I realized as I was making the last slide that I used the term polarized very loosely there. But I wanted to keep the slide the way I recorded it because I'm going to show you my range. It's right in front of you because I imagine some people would like to see my range. But I also want to showcase what I mean by a polarized range, especially if you're using it in the sense that you might be a little bit less familiar with. So if I wanted to illustrate the concept of what a polarized range is to a completely new player, what I would probably do is show them like, hey, when you face a bet on the flop, you might raise with your sets, and those are your value raises, and then you might bluff raise with some hands that are like 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight, or some maybe backdoor flush draws with overcards. Those, would be your bluff raises. So that's a very polarized range where you clearly have like some awesome hands like your sets, and you clearly have some bluffs. When you're raising your sets, you hope he calls. When you're raising your bluffs, you hope he folds. It's a very clear polarized range. If I show someone this, and I would still say this is kind of a polarized-ish 3-betting range, most people are going to look at this and go, that's not polarized. The only really polarized component is the King 9, King 8, King 7, King 6, King 5 suited. Those are all called, whereas I'm 3-betting my better suited hands, and then I'm 3-betting my weaker suited hands, my weaker suited kings and my better suited kings. So that is polarized, right? You're 3-betting the better suited kings and the weaker suited kings and calling with the stuff in the middle. I just tweaked the range a little bit because it's been a few months since I've played, and I actually probably would make this small adjustment right now. So I'd add in a little bit more of a polarized component where I'm calling with my suited connectors that can make the better pairs, and then I'm 3-betting the weaker ones. Note that 7-6 suited, 6-5 suited, and 5-4 suited still can make all of their straight combos. So I probably would tweak it a little bit, but no big deal. But you can see it's a little bit more polarized. But the much more important thing for you to understand is the concept that I'm about to illustrate. So just clear your mind for a minute. Don't get overly caught up with this cash game 3-betting range. But think for a minute how your 3-betting range would look if you had to make either really small 3-bets, middle-sized 3-bets, or big 3-bets. So let's use Poker Snowy for that. So we're 100 big blinds deep here. Now imagine we can decide with 5-4 suited in the big blind whether or not we want to 3-bet small, big, or in between. You can already tell one of the ranges, spoiler alert. So we can 3-bet small, middle, or in between. Well, the first thing I would think is a small 3-bet might not be very effective because a small 3-bet's not going to have much fold equity. So if we look at the smaller 3-bets, 3-betting is negative EV, right? A pot size 3-bet. So a pot size 3-bet is to $19, which I know this is kind of the commonly accepted 3-bet sizing for cash games, but I do think that's on the small side. I actually think in theory the 3-bet should be a little bit bigger. But if we look at the small 3-betting sizes, we see that 3-betting is negative EV, right? And now again, pause for a moment. Like I'd really encourage you to pause for a moment and think why that would be the case. Why would 3-betting small with 5-4 suited be negative EV? So hopefully you've paused. And the reason for that is even though 5-4 suited has super robust equity, right? Like it makes flushes and straights, and they're pretty awesome. Even though it has super robust equity, when we like make a half pot size 3-bet, we're not really getting all that many folds. So it's probably not all that effective to put more money in the pot if we don't really have fold equity. When we make a pot size 3-bet, this one I am surprised is more negative EV than the even smaller 3-bet. But again, I think it's conceptually similar. We're just not getting that many folds. So if we're not going to get that many folds when we 3-bet a pot size 3-bet, like let's look to see how often Snowy defends, just so we can look. Pre-flop advice. Like Snowy's calling really wide. Like most people watching this video probably don't call this wide. But Snowy's defending very wide against the 3-bet when you make a pot size 3-bet. And it's also like going for those 4-bets too. So even when the opponent opened like ace-7 off, it's 4-betting half the time. So because of that, it doesn't look like, according to Snowy, it doesn't think it's very profitable to make a pot size 3-bet here. In reality, for the vast majority of limits, I imagine it would be profitable because I don't think people defend that wide. But Snowy thinks you should defend that wide, so it's a negative EV 3-bet. Now let's see what happens if we make a 2 times pot 3-bet. All of a sudden, it's positive EV. In fact, the EV of double potting it, I don't even know how big that is. I should know this. This is one of those things where, I mean, I guess I could do it, but we're just going to trial and error. What is it, like 27? Nope. 31. Okay, so it's like 32. So 32 is a 2 times pot size raise. Snowy actually thinks that has the EV that's equal to calling. Equal to calling, which is why it's a mixed strat. So once you're making the 3-bet big enough with a hand like 5-4 suited, it might actually be profitable because, again, this is how I'm interpreting what Snowy's saying, and it makes sense to me. But of course, I don't know why Snowy's actually doing what it does. Snowy never explains anything. But it could be like, okay, well, wait a second. If we 3-bet small, we make the pot bigger and don't have that much fold equity. But if we 3-bet big, we'll get a lot of folds, and 5-4 suited still has really robust equity, right? So 5-4 suited can still win a giant pot, even if we make the opponent's range a lot stronger, because 5-4 suited kind of has to make like 2-pair trips, 2-pair trips, flushes, or straights to win at showdown. So it can make sense to 3-bet a hand like 5-4 suited, a hand that has very robust equity once the 3-bet gets big enough. So my 3-bet sizing for cash games is somewhere in between a pot and 2 times pot size bets. And I'm not looking at Snowy like an answer key or anything like that. And in theory, you'd probably use multiple 3-bet sizing and all that fun jazz. But that's why you see me kind of have this range. Because it's like, okay, well, I'm getting a decent amount of fold equity. I do 3-bet it bigger than a pot size 3-bet, so I get more fold equity than Snowy does when it, pots it from the big blind shoes. But I'm also not 2 times potting it, so I'm not making a massive 3-bet. It's somewhere in between, closer to a pot than 2-pot. So that's how I ended up with this range, and of course, I have no way of knowing if I'm right. This is just what seemed reasonable to me. And in fact, trying to be consistent with my logic, Snowy, let's look right here. Let's look at pocket sevens, because I just noticed that was in my range. Oops. All right, pocket sevens. I'm sure there's a clever name for it that I don't know of. Poker Snowy thinks it's a mixed strategy between calling and raising with sevens with a pot size 3-bet. But I'm betting, I could be wrong, that a 2 times pot size 3-bet with sevens is really ineffective. Because once you're doubling the size of the pot, you might actually make the button start folding, under pairs that we dominate. So my guess is 2 times potting, it's really bad. Oh, not really bad, but it's less EV than calling. So being consistent with that, and this has a higher EV than I was expecting, but being consistent with that, I probably can also say to myself, like, okay, well, if Snowy thinks it's a mixed strategy with just potting it, maybe if I'm making it a little bit bigger than potting it, I should be taking pocket sevens out of my 3-betting range, because I might make my opponent fold these underpairs, especially in practice. So I'm actually going to look at that real quick. Let's see if we double pot it. Let's see what Snowy does with its underpairs. Let's look at that pre-flop advice. It starts folding them. So that might be why sevens loses EV as we make the 3-bet bigger. And again, a lot of this stuff is really just about retaining equity. All right, so we're not going to get caught up in the cash game deep stuff, but you can see kind of where ranges come from, and I really want you to understand conceptually what's going on. Okay, so let's make a tournament situation. So scenarios, new, and I'm going to make it again like tourney size numbers. And I really haven't looked at this stuff yet. I do like not having some scripted stuff to show you, because I think it's interesting trying to solve problems when something doesn't go the way I expected it. So let's say fold, fold, fold. It folds to the button. And then we're going to make ourselves like 40, let's say we're going to make ourselves 4,000 chips, so 20 big blinds deep. All right? Now, let's also, again, be realistic with tournament situations. So let's say the button min raises, even though I don't like it. Let's say the small blind folds and we're in the big blind. Here, it's not going to make sense for us to 3-bet those hands with very robust equity if we can't make our 3-bet big enough to make them worthwhile. So, if you wanted to 3-bet here to, let's say, let's see what the different sizings are. So pot would be 1,300. A lot of times people make really small 3-bets. So let's say that this person wants to 3-bet to half pot, like 8, which would be 850. And again, I'm not saying I agree with these sizings, but it's pretty common to see people want to do this for tournaments. All right, so let's look at range advice. So if you're going to 3-bet to half pot size 3-bet, so if you make it a pot, so Snowy recommends if you have to pick one sizing, you use a pot size 3-bet here, which is to 1,300. And again, Snowy's always restricted on half pot pot or, half pot pot or 2 times pot. All right, so if you are making a pot size 3-bet, Snowy's 3-betting 11.7%. But if you're making a half pot size 3-bet, Snowy 3-bets more aggressively. But I'm guessing if we make a half pot size 3-bet, let's do right here, 850. My guess is the button never folds anything. Okay, it folds 5%, close enough. Now, you may actually be forced in tournaments, or if you're playing cash games and someone's short stacked, to make really small 3-bets. We'll get into that in more detail in a little bit. But you may be forced to make really small 3-bets in some cases. Now, if you're making a really small 3-bet against an opponent that, where were you? That goes all in 5% of the time, calls 90% of the time, and folds 5% of the time. If you're making a really small 3-bet against an opponent that plays that way, how should your 3-betting range look? Linear, polarized, or condensed? Pause for a moment and think, but it should clearly be like linear, right? Because you're making the pot bigger and your opponent's never folding. So let's look to see what the EV of, like, let's see if we have 5-4 suited here. Let's look to see what the EV of 3-betting. So if we're going to 2 times pot it, the EV was 0.42. If we're going to half pot it, the EV was 0.13. Again, it makes sense to think, and of course calling was more profitable at RB raise sizing, but it was really close between calling and 3-betting when we were starting to 3-bet deeper. But again, we don't have the stack depth to really utilize this robust equity. So I would hate, and this isn't based on what Snowy just told me, I don't like 3-betting with this type of hand with this stack depth. Because no matter what 3-bet size you use, if you 3-bet small, well, your opponent's not really going to fold anything, and you just made the pot big with a hand that doesn't have that much equity, and you don't really need robust equity with this stack depth. If you make the 3-bet big, yeah, you're probably going to now make him fold some hands that dominate you. Like, for example, he might fold King 5 suited or something like that, or Ace 5 off. You're going to make him fold some of those hands, but you don't have this stack depth to keep playing and win a really big pot post-flop like you would with 100 big blind stack depth. So it seems like just 3-betting 5-4 suited here is pretty bad. So I would think here you're going to use a linear 3-betting range. So again, let's follow Snowy's advice, and it makes pot size 3-bets, and let's see what it does. I'm guessing this is going to be a very linear. Oh, I can just look at the pre-flop range, huh? Pre-flop advice. Okay. Oh, I didn't even know this. I could have even looked at 2-pot or half. Oh, awesome. So if we look at pot size 3-bets, we see that we're 3-betting a pretty linear range. Half pot's completely linear, right? It's just upper left-hand corner, all the good stuff is the stuff we're always 3-betting. I know it's using all these little mixed strats, but Snowy doesn't play a half pot 3-betting game anyways, so I wouldn't put too much stock in it, but you can see it's 3-betting a linear range. If we use pot size, it's still quite linear, right? It's still a linear range. And then if we use 2 times pot, we can start seeing little polarized components, right? Like we can see that, we're 3-betting all this really good stuff, and then we're doing the exact same thing I was doing with suited kings in my cash game range, which is we're 3-betting the Ace 2 suited 100% of the time, and then we're calling with a lot of the stuff in the middle. It's doing the same thing with Ace X off, but it's part of mixed strats. It's 3-betting the weaker ones and calling the stuff in the middle. I think this stuff is super cool, and I'm going to illustrate another example that I think is really cool. Let's suppose that the button agrees with me and doesn't like min raising, so they raise it to 500 chips. Folds from the small blind, then now it's on the big blind shoes, and we don't want to just talk about 5-4 suited. Think about the kind of 3-bet sizing that the big blind can use here. If the big blind doesn't want a 3-bet so big that it can never really fold to a 4-bet, it might be making its 3-bet to something like, let's say, 1125 or 1150. If it 3-bets to 1125, the button's going to be getting an awesome price, right? So it's probably not going to fold very much. Let's look. Range advice. Yeah, it only folds 8% of the time. That actually doesn't mean the big blind made a mistake here. But if the big blind only 3-bets to 1125, the button's not going to fold very much. So pause for a moment and think. If you're 3-betting to 1125 here, should it be a linear, polarized, or condensed 3-betting range? It's never condensed, but I just throw it out. So should it be a linear or a polarized range here? Well, the button doesn't fold. It should be a linear range. But it's also really hard. Like, let's say we change the bet sizing to, I'm going to pick a number that's a little bit bigger. But like for cash games, if you were deeper, it might be normal to like, this would be, and ignore the 2 zeros. So this would be like a $5 open at 1-2. You might 3-bet it to something like 1800. You can't do that here because you can't 3-bet and fold to 1800. So you might feel like if you're playing in a tournament, your realistic 3-bet sizes might be like, okay, maybe like 1150. So you could 3-bet and then fold. Or maybe it's something like, it might even be smaller than that, to be honest. It might even be like only 1,000. Or maybe you have to go all in. Or maybe you're crazy good and you're actually going to deal with learning both ranges. But if you are 3-betting to like 1150, it probably needs to be a linear 3-betting range. Whereas if you're going to go all in, and it could make sense to go all in with some hands here. Let's just plug in any hand for Snowy right here. Let's plug in like ace-5 suited. All right, so Snowy is choosing its raising sizing as 2 times pot here. So if it's going to defend, it's going to defend by going all in. Whereas a lot of people, I think, would think this ship is kind of big. But let's see how it would play. So half pot is 1050. So let's see how it would play. So here you can see, for example, Snowy actually thinks potting it is the most profitable line. But because this is green, this bet size tab is green, it means if Snowy can only pick one range, it will 2 times pot it. So it's kind of showcasing how, in theory, you would use multiple different bet sizing ranges. Anyways, let's look at the preflop advice now that I have seen the magic of this button right here. Again, half pot, linear, because you're giving your opponent such a good price. And a lot of people, I think, would actually 3-bet to like 1,000 chips here if they were playing in a tournament. I've seen that so many times just when talking tournament strategy with people. Potting it, still pretty much linear. You're still giving the guy a really good price. And then 2 times potting it. Okay, we're starting to see, not as much, but we're starting to still see some polarized component here, right? Like it's 3-betting with the ace-2 suited, but it's using a mixed strategy with some of the middle aces. If I wanted to stress my point better, which I do, because there's all these little details that I'm trying not to go into too much detail about, because I think we're covering a lot of very useful stuff, and we don't want to get bogged down with details. But yeah, if we made it bigger, the stacked up bigger. Okay, so now Snowy's changed its bet sizing rather than 2 times spotting it to just 1 time spot it. And since it's harder for Snowy to go all in, range advice, here we'll see a more Here we'll see a more exaggerated version of what I was just trying to illustrate, I bet. So again, pot is pretty much linear. Half pot is for sure linear. 2 times pot, polarized, more polarized. So again, not totally illustrating the concept the way I want it to, but you can see, like, even though it's looking like a mixed strat here, you can see, and I do this when I'm playing in cash games, you can see, like, the aces that the big blind wants to call with the most here are like the ace-9 and the ace-8, because they keep some dominated hands in by calls. Okay, so while I think this is incredibly important, I don't want to beat a dead horse. So understand that as your 3-bet sizing gets bigger, you pick up fold equity. And then as your 3-bet size gets bigger and you pick up fold equity, it starts to make more sense to 3-bet a polarized range. Because now you can start to say to yourself, like, if I 3-bet big, I might make my opponent fold, like his aces without a great kicker or his kings without a great kicker. So because of that, since my 3-betting big folds those hands, it makes sense for me to 3-bet a polarized range. I'll 3-bet my good aces and my good kings, because those can get called by aces and kings I dominate. And I'll 3-bet my weak aces and my weak kings, because those can make aces and kings that beat me fold. So you get that polarized range developed, and then everything else we've already talked about is still going to be at play, where even when you're 3-betting a polarized range, like let me bring up my Flopzilla range again. Even when you're 3-betting a polarized range, again, this component's polarized, the king 4 to king 2 suited, I'm still being like, hey, it's going to be a 3-bet pot, so I want some robust equity, so I'm 3-betting the flush draws, whereas I'm not 3-betting the offsuit ones. Whereas for some of the tournament situations we just looked at, Snowy was actually 3-betting some of the offsuit aces, because robust equity matters less when there's less stacked up. So tons of things that play at once. I imagine this is a little overwhelming if you're learning it all for the first time, but hopefully you can see how, like, everything seems to be clicking, like everything seems to be making sense. Whereas you should be a lot more skeptical if you ask someone a question and they don't really have a good answer for why they do what they do. So if you ask someone, like, well, wait a second, why aren't you flatting in the big blind when there's shallow stack depth? And they just say, like, oh no, a push or fold strategy is profitable. You don't want to call. You're not going to know what to do post flop. If they start saying stuff that doesn't really seem like it makes a lot of sense, or if their answer is just like, oh, well, because everyone told me to do it, then you want to be a lot more skeptical. But all the theory we've talked about seems to be clicking and making sense here to me. So if you have a question, ask me in the forums. I'll try to address it. But to me, all this stuff makes sense. So it makes me feel like, oh, this is what's actually correct. A lot of the advice that was given a couple years ago for how to combat shorties actually probably wasn't very good advice. At least not from a theoretical perspective. Because against good opponents, min raising in the button, especially with shallow stack depth, probably isn't very good in a lot of spots. At least not 20 big blinds deep, in my opinion. And likewise, the more important thing is think you need to push or fold when you're in the big blind probably is very, very bad when you have shallow stack depth. And again, a lot of people still think that. I'm not going to touch cold calling in the small blind. I think stuff can get very murky and very confusing, so we're not going to touch that for now, but it might be something I approach in the future. But in the small blind, when you're not calling, then you can use like the linear 3-betting range. And in reality, I could see how in theory, as stacks get shallower, making a small blind cold calling range might make more sense. So let's go over the key points from concept number 3. When you 3-bet small, your opponent gets an awesome price and doesn't fold. Your 3-betting range should thus be more linear. All other theory still applies. Non-robust equity is more valuable than it would be if stacks were deeper. When stacks are deeper and you can make a bigger 3-bet, you get more fold equity on your 3-bet and can thus use a more polarized range. So, 3-betting large with 7-6 suited with stack depth may be very effective since we have robust equity and fold equity. It's likely quite bad, however, when stacks are shallow and or usually and our 3-bet is small. So those two are usually going to go together. You're often going to see the small 3-bet be the sizing of choice by players who are small stacked. And if that's the case, you're not going to want a 3-bet hand like 7-6 suited. It just doesn't play very well. So yeah, a small 3-bet and the shallow stack usually go together. Concept number 4, calling 3-bets in position. We've already discussed this a lot because we couldn't really talk about the 3-betting range without also discussing the 3-bet calling range. So we've already covered a lot of ground for this topic. And we saw how aggressively Snowy called 3-bets in position. And again, this made sense because when we're in position and calling a small 3-bet, we're getting an awesome price on our call, and it's much easier for us to realize our equity than it would be if stacks were deep. A lot easier to play a 3-bet pot with King 8 suited when you have shallow stacks compared to deep stacks. Let's look to see what kind of hand Snowy recommends defending when we face a small 3-bet with shallow stack depth. So this is the kind of stuff that you can totally work out by hand if you're trying to figure out defending ranges, and I would recommend you do this if you're really trying to work stuff out. But just for the purpose of this video right now, when we only have a couple minutes left, I think it's probably going to be better if we just bust out Snowy and see what it says so we can kind of visualize the ranges, because my guess is it's just going to recommend the kind of non-robust hands we already were talking about. So here we're 25 big blinds deep. So let's imagine that the big blind 3-bets to 11.25 like we talked about before. And again, I'm not saying I recommend this sizing, but this is the kind of sizing that I think you're usually going to see. And so it's probably a very interesting sizing to understand. So 3-bets to 11.25. I think we folded very little here, right? The button folded. Okay, 9% now. So I think it's folding a little bit more than it was earlier because we have a little bit more stack depth for 25 big blinds deep. Again, assuming I remember that correctly, which I'm pretty sure I do, that's all consistent with the theory we already were talking about. And let's look at that pre-flop advice. Sorry. Okay, so Snowy is calling super wide. So this is actually a little bit off, I think. We would definitely want to 4-bet all in more aggressively here, I believe. But Snowy's probably responding. Snowy doesn't like this 3-bet sizing, and so it's probably responding a little bit weird. But yeah, I think you definitely would want to 4-bet here significantly more aggressively. Okay. So this isn't being illustrated as clearly as I'd like because Snowy is defending so incredibly much here that it's only folding a couple of the offsuit hands. And to me, it is a little bit surprising that, let me think if I can get a good example. So here, Snowy is calling with 6-4 suited, but folding ace-6 off, even though ace-6 off has a lot more equity. So that's somewhat inconsistent with what we've been talking about. But, you know, it's not like it's a binary thing, and 6-4 suited has a lot more robust equity than ace-6 suited does. So that doesn't seem hugely problematic. And at the end of the day, the range that Snowy might think the big blind's 3-betting with is very different than the range we might think. Because again, like it's hard to analyze this spot, I guess, with Snowy, because Snowy, like if we copy and paste, copy scenario, if we look, Snowy is not recommending to half pot it like we did. It's recommending a pot size 3-bet. So because of that, it's probably harder to analyze the spot, because I would describe this being similar to when someone asks you what to do with a hand on the river, but they already took a bad line on the flop in the turn. So I'm sure most of you guys have had that experience before where someone asks you what to do on the river, but their flop and their turn line you think is bad. So it's really hard for you to give them river advice when you're like, well, yeah, but I wouldn't have taken that line on the flop or the turn. Or another thing might be like, it's hard to give someone advice when they are playing against an opponent that took a line that makes no sense. So in other words, like your opponent might have raised on a flop or a turn where you think they should have no raising range. So it's kind of hard to give advice for how to respond. Okay, so I can't really illustrate this concept that well in Snowy, I guess, because Snowy just thinks when you 3-bet so small, you shouldn't be folding much to begin with. So here, Snowy opened, I think, a pretty tight button opening range compared to what most people would open here. So for example, Snowy folded 3-4 suited on the button. It folded 5-3 suited on the button. Again, that's consistent with, hey, it has a lot of robust equity, but we don't really need robust equity with this stacked up. So that's not unreasonable. But it also didn't open Queen 4 suited, Queen 3 suited, Queen 2 suited. I think a lot of people watching this video would open those hands. And so Snowy might have a tighter opening range. And on top of that, when Snowy gets 3-bet, it doesn't want to fold to this price. So it's not really illustrating the concept that I wanted it to, because it's basically just not folding to the small 3-bets. So still a useful thing to see, but it's not showing the whole, hey, look, it's emphasizing high equity hands that have non-robust equity over the robust, or over the hands that have robust equity but have less overall equity. Okay, so I played around with Snowy a little bit more, trying different opening sizes and different 3-bet sizes with different stack depths. And for the most part, it's just hard to illustrate this concept well. I think there's going to be a lot of spots where you can really emphasize the non-robust equity as you're shallow and calling a 3-bet. But for the most part, if you make the 3-bet small enough, Snowy's just defending the vast majority of its range. So it's not really illustrating the concept that I was hoping it would illustrate. So if there's anything to kind of take from this, it's really just when you're getting that good of a price and you don't have that much stack depth, you can just call really wide. That's what the main message I think Snowy was giving was. It wasn't so much how to call with what types of hands. It was more of you just call basically almost everything. So let's talk for a moment with where we are for this series. Right now, I think we're really seeing how with certain stack depth, it's very hard to find a 3-bet sizing that allows you to 3-bet and fold to a jam. And if you can't 3-bet and fold to a jam, you should just be jamming yourself, right? Because if you're always calling your opponent when he jams, then you might as well go all in yourself because you take away one of your opponent's options. So make sure you understand that if you're never folding to a 4-bet jam from your opponent, then you should just 3-bet jam yourself in theory. So we're seeing for certain stack depth, it's very hard to find a 3-bet range that can fold to a 4-bet that also still has fold equity with your 3-bet. Because if you make your 3-bet small enough that you can fold to a 4-bet, your opponent just doesn't really fold anything. And again, none of that means your 3-bet sizing is wrong. But to me, it starts to become very interesting to think like, okay, if we can't 3-bet very big, maybe there's a lot of spots where we would have 2 3-betting ranges. We would have one 3-betting range that's the linear 3-betting range where we're not 3-betting that big, but we know we're always going to be called. And since we're 3-betting a linear range, we have hands in our range that always do pretty well in the 3-bet pot. So maybe you have one linear 3-betting range, and then you might be able to develop another sort of jamming 3-betting range. So I think if I'm just playing cash games, I can just use one 3-bet sizing and it will work pretty well. That might be less doable as you get into certain stack depths for tournaments. Okay, so let's recap about the concepts we've talked about and try to tie them all together. So the first thing we really showed was there is no stack depth where you have to play a push or fold game in the big blind against a button min raise or a very small button open. It can probably even be quite a bit bigger than a min raise. So even if you're only 10 big blinds deep and the button min raises, if anything, that's an argument to encourage you to open up your calling range there because you can't get pushed off your equity post flop. So just because you have little stacked up behind does not mean you need to play this push or fold game in the big blind. So that I think is one of the most important things, and that's one of the first things we discussed. You always should have a calling range in the big blind against a button open, regardless of how shallow you are. The next thing we did is showcase how awkward 3-betting is with certain stack depth. Because if you 3-bet giving yourself room to fold to a 4-bet, and also keep in mind, if you were never going to fold to a 4-bet, then you should just 3-bet all in, because that takes away one of your opponent's options. So from a theoretical perspective, if you're 3-betting and not 3-betting all in, you should have some folding range to a 4-bet all in. Anyhow, so if you are going to 3-bet at certain stack depth, it's very awkward because if you 3-bet small, then your opponent's really never going to fold almost anything. If literally maybe he won't fold anything. So if you 3-bet really small, he's going to fold just about nothing, in which case you want to 3-bet a linear range. But when you 3-bet bigger, you're not going to be able to 3-bet and fold, so then you're going to have to go all in. So there's a lot of stack depth where you can't make the comfortable 3-bet sizing. So here, this was a pot size 3-bet against a little over button min raise. You can make that kind of 3-bet sizing, and that is what Snowy recommends when you're 50 big blinds deep. But you probably can't work with this sizing when you're 25 or 30 big blinds deep, because you can't 3-bet and then fold to a 4-bet. So because of that, you kind of just got to go all in when you want to 3-bet, or you have to pick a smaller 3-bet sizing and not have much fold equity, in which case then you need to use the linear 3-betting range. So I guess that was the main take-home message, which is if you have to 3-bet small, you need to use closer to a linear 3-betting range, and you need to expect to almost always be called. And then the final point, which was, I guess, kind of weird, was I was trying to showcase spots where you would emphasize non-robust equity by calling a 3-bet. But it looked like when you made the 3-bets so small, which is what's very common as you play with shallow stacks, people either go all in or they 3-bet very small. If they're going all in, it's just an easy, equity calculation. But if they're 3-betting small, I wanted to show, hey, we can still emphasize non-robust equity. But instead, it looks like Snowy's just like, no, dude, if they 3-bet that small, you just call, like, everything. So that concept, I guess, wasn't illustrated that clearly in Snowy, but you can still see how non-robust equity does get better in every single type of range as stack sizes get shallow. But realistically, if the opponent's making a super small 3-bet from the big blind and you're in the button, you're going to want to call with the vast, vast majority of your range to begin with. You're folding very little, and we saw in many spots Snowy was defending like 90 or 95% of its range. So the next step, I think, would be to actually start designing all these different 3-bet sizings and 3-bet calling ranges and cold calling ranges and changing it based on antes. I think that would be the next step, but it would be quite difficult to do, not for any one given stack depth, but you just would have to understand your 3-bet sizing, your calling ranges, your shipping ranges, all that stuff would change very quickly as you go from like 25 to 30 to 35 big blinds deep. And it's a little bit counterintuitive, I think, for cash game players, because I think cash game players like to imagine being 100 big blinds deep is like so different from being 250 big blinds deep. But it's really not. Like, especially with pre-flop play, but even post-flop play, you're probably not changing your lines very much based on whether you're 100 or 250 big blinds deep, even though that's like the cool concepts people have liked to talk about. Whereas the place where ranges really are going to change very, very quickly is when you go from 32 big blinds deep to 22 big blinds deep. Yeah, that stuff is actually discussed less, I think, or at least it is among, cash game players from what I've seen. So the next step would be to actually design a whole bunch of ranges, and you'd have to change them for a lot of different stack depth. I might end up doing that, but I don't know if that's a worthwhile video for me to make yet, so go ahead and post your thoughts on the forums. And realistically, I would think that'd be something that's very useful to understand and do if you are a professional tournament player. But if you're just playing tournaments casually, or many people that are watching this video that probably just play poker as a part-time hobby, it's probably much more important to just understand the theory and have a general idea rather than actually calculate out all the ranges, which would be time-consuming and would require a lot of different ranges. So yeah, sorry if it got kind of murky the last 10 minutes. I think it's just stuff that's pretty complicated and there wasn't really a way around that. So thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video, and good luck at the tables. Take care.